His very own Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill architecture firm, or SOM for short. Now, fun fact, my brother-in-law is an architect who works for SOM, and he was one of the guys who helped design this building. And this is a fantastic example of a style of construction that we're going to talk about a bit on the river this evening, called contextualism. And here's how it works. So you see the three patios at different heights. You have one here on the right, then the left, then the right. Those are at very specific heights. This first one here on the right is at the same height as the roof of the Wrigley building that we just talked about. That one on the left, same height as the roof of that rocket-shaped looking building across the river. And then that one all the way up there on the right is at the same height as the roof of this black boxy building that we're seeing coming into view on the other side. And again, this is a style of construction known as contextualism. It's all about honoring the context or the environment that surrounds the building. Sort of an architect's way of giving little fist bumps or handshakes to the structures and the environment that surround their building. Now, the top-level penthouse in this building sold back in 2014 for $17 million. Nice little starter home there for someone. Now, the fellow who bought that penthouse actually never ended up moving in, and he sold it last year. It was, he sold it last year, and then it was resold again this year for $20 million. Nice little profit. All right, folks, another one of my absolute favorites here to the right. Eyes up, cameras up. The twin iconic Corncob Towers of Marina City. So Marina City was designed and built in the 1960s by architect Bertrand Goldberg. And Goldberg was kind of a social scientist, so he was really interested in how people lived. So with Marina City, he was looking to design a fully self-sufficient, self-contained city within a city. And that's what he did. So let me explain how things work at Marina City. So you're going to get your condo upstairs, or you have to furnish a pie slice-shaped living room. A little difficult, but I'm told it can be done. And then you're going to live above your valet-parked car, your parked yacht, because who doesn't have a yacht? And then you're going to live above a movie theater, bowling alley, restaurant, shops, and office space. We like to refer to Marina City as an introvert's dream world. All right. Folks, hopping back over here to the left, you'll see just a little stretch of the iconic Chicago Riverwalk down by the river level. Now, this is a project that was conceived all the way back in 1909, but it wasn't started under construction until about 2003, and it cost $112 million. It stretches all the way along the left side of the river here downtown. This is a project that has absolutely transformed the city's relationship with the river. It's brought more people down to the river's edge than ever before in the city's history. So it was well worth every penny. All right, this building coming into view here on the left with the white granite base and the mirror-ribbed reflective glass there. If you look all the way to the top, you can see that roof. It looks a bit like a temple, maybe the Parthenon, yeah? This is a good example of a neoclassical style of architecture. And the way that style works is you take key traits or features of classic architectural styles like that temple roof, but you build it on a more modern-looking building with modern materials. That's your neoclassical style. Of course, neo is a prefix that means new. So you have new classical, basically old meets new. Now the area of the city over here to the left where that building is located has a nickname. It's called the Loop. And it's called the Loop because our public trains, which also have a nickname, they're called the L, which is short for elevated, as a lot of the tracks are raised above the ground. The L runs in a loop around this downtown city center. Really important to the infrastructure of the city. I love taking the train, taking the L. I also take the buses. Here in Chicago, we call it the CTA. That's Chicago Transit Authority. That is our public transportation system here. Now, something really important to understand about Chicago is that this city honors its architectural heritage. There is a deep, deep respect and appreciation for what came before. So I have a couple examples coming up of what I mean by that more specifically. The first example is this building coming into view on the left side of the river here. You'll notice a black stripe of windows down the front of the building towards the right. The section on the left of that stripe was built in 1927, but the section to the right was 1987. So 60-year difference, but you can tell how the architect with the addition on the right honored the original intention of the first. Yeah? Same basic design, just a little bit more modern looking. Also, real quick, you can see the L in action, so you really see why it's called the L, short for elevated. Now, the Wells Street Bridge we're passing under is another good example of honoring architectural heritage here, because even though this bridge looks like all the other iconic Chicago-style bridges along the river that are 80, 90, 100 years old, this one's only 8 years old. And that's because it was designed as a replica so that it would fit in with that architectural heritage. All right, eyes up, cameras up, another one of my favorites. Here to the right, the massive Merchandise Mart from 1929, and this is the first example of the Art Deco style that we're going to talk about today. Here are the key traits of the Art Deco style. First of all, you have those deep inset windows which create vertical racing stripes that draws your eye towards the roof. It's covered in precision repetitive patterns and then finished with polished limestone and metal ornamentation. Now, this was 1929, the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age. There was a lot of excitement and optimism in the air about a machine-made future full of airline travel and fancy cars. And the style Art Deco was intended to express that optimism that people had for that technological future. All right, folks, here we are. We have reached the trophy case of the Chicago River. This is Wolf Point, where the three branches of the Chicago River come together. This is also where the city was first founded. The cradle of Chicago, all the way back in the 1770s, just a couple taverns and trading posts here at Wolf Point. Kind of hard to envision now, though, when you see the incredible amount of development we have here. All right, let's talk about this very kind of scary looking building straight ahead on the right side of the river with the really narrow Y-shaped base. Now, this building is named after its address, 150 North Riverside. It's just a few years old, designed by Getch Partners architecture firm, and there are a couple reasons why that base is so narrow. The first is that the back 2/3 of the lot that it sits on are occupied by active Amtrak and Metro train lines. And then in the front by the river, the city has a zoning law that says that every new building built along the river must be set back 30 feet from the edge of the river at the ground level. That means this building occupies only 20% of its total lot space at the ground level. So it's such a tall, skinny building, why doesn't it just fall over? Yeah? Well, the answer is, it sways in the wind. Now, a number of buildings in Chicago sway in the wind, and although that sounds scary, it's actually a good thing. Here's why. When wind hits the side of a skyscraper, it puts a tremendous amount of stress on the foundation of the building. So if a building didn't sway, that wind could crack or damage the foundation. So when a building sways, it's relieving that pressure, yeah? But we also don't want it to sway too much, because that would also be bad. So there are a few ways that you can minimize the sway in a building. And the system that 150 North Riverside uses is called inertial slosh dampers. And that's a mouthful, so let me explain. On the top floor of this building, there are 12 concrete tanks full of 160,000 gallons of water. I'm going to be the building and demonstrate for you, okay? So say the wind hits the building on this side. It's going to sway over here. Well, when it sways over here, the water in those tanks are going to slosh in the opposite direction, which brings it back over here, and so on and so forth. And that basically has an equalizing effect, and it brings the building to rest much more quickly. That's a really incredible innovation that these engineers and architects have come up with that allows a building like 150 North Riverside to exist, yeah? Could never have been built on that lot unless we have that technology. All right, the good question that we always get is how long does it take and how much does it cost to build a new building on the river these days? Well, perfect example here to the left. This is the Bank of America building. It was just finished about a year ago. It took about 3 years to construct and cost roughly $800 million. That's pretty standard for a building this size on the river these days. I had a tour last week where one of the passengers said, "Hey, I helped pay for that building." And then I realized, oh my goodness, so did I. I am the patron of Bank of America. You're welcome. All right, folks, I'm about to give you a short history lesson on the evolution of Chicago architecture. And we're going to be focusing on the next 5 buildings here to the right, starting with this Art Deco building from 1929. Again, this is Art Deco. It's got the precision, repetitive patterns and a limestone facade. Now, again, this was 1929, the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, and a lot of excitement in the air. You know, we had flappers at that time. But that year, the stock market crashed, and that sent the United States into the Great Depression, which was the greatest economic downturn we've ever faced in this country. So from about 1930 to 1957, there were basically no new office buildings built anywhere in the country. We were sort of an office building drought, so to speak. We had bigger fish to fry at that time. But in the late 50s and 60s, when architecture was rebooted with modern style buildings, a Chicagoland native architect by the name of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, another mouthful, he came on the scene and introduced us to a style of modern building that we at Shoreline refer to as black box modernism. Pretty straightforward name for that style, right? Now remember, the people that were working and building in the 50s and 60s, they grew up during the Depression, right? Which meant they didn't want to spend more money than they had to. And they really didn't want to argue about how many gargoyles to put on the roof or what kind of limestone to put on the outside. They wanted something simple and efficient with no frills. And that's when Mies van der Rohe said, hey, how about the simple elegance of a black box? And that's how we get our black box modern style buildings, also known as Miesian style modernism, after Mies van der Rohe himself. Now, Mies van der Rohe is arguably one of the most influential architects to ever exist. He's the guy that coined the phrase less is more. He also believed that form follows function. Those were his primary design philosophies. So we've made it from the Art Deco of the late 1920s through the late 50s and 60s with new modern style buildings like these black boxes here. And that brings us up to the 70s with this white box up ahead on the right. From 1971, this is an example of the international style of architecture. Very popular across the country in the 70s, and it's very similar to the black box style. It's just lighter and brighter, right? It's made with stone and concrete instead of this black steel. But then, the 80s shows up. And in the 80s, we have big hair, shoulder pads, neon. People were looking for something bigger, flashier, brighter, and more exciting. And that is when contextualism shows up, which I mentioned earlier with Trump Tower. So up ahead, this building with the curved wall of reflective glass windows, that curve reflects the neighborhood. It makes things look good. It flatters the context. So there you have it. Art Deco of the late 20s, that architectural drought, and modern buildings like black box modernism in the late 50s and 60s. We get the international style of the 70s, and then the contextualism of the 80s. I also love to point out the irony of a bakery next to a fitness center. Nothing architecturally interesting there. I just think it's a brilliant marketing strategy. All right, folks, so this building coming into view here on the left just past the bridge for many years was a pretty standard black box building, nothing special. But back in 2014, the owners really wanted to be special, so they spent over $800,000 to put themselves on the map by putting the map on themselves. So this is a 2-scale map of the Chicago River. That red brick up there is the "You Are Here" dot. All right, if there are any Batman fans on the boat, let's nerd out about this next building, shall we? Up ahead on the right, this massive concrete building. This is the Old Main Post Office from 1925. But you might recognize it as Gotham City Bank from the beginning of 2008's The Dark Knight. So this is the building that the Joker and his henchmen robbed. They drove a bus out of the first floor onto the street. My friend Brian is a stuntman based here in Chicago, and he actually played the henchman that ziplined to the roof of the Old Main Post Office at the beginning of that film. Something that a lot of people don't know is that Chicago is the basis for Gotham City. So that is the inspiration for the city where Batman lives and operates. Now, when that movie was shot in 2008, this building was empty. It had been abandoned since the early 90s. But it was purchased a few years later, and a lot of money was poured into renovating it. So all in all, about $900 million spent on the Old Main Post Office. Also, I can't help but point out that I'm pretty sure this is a little bit of snow. So you never know what you're gonna get in Chicago in March, right? But it's an adventure, folks. We're all in this together. All right, so we are now making our way down the South Branch of the Chicago River, and things are a little quieter, a little slower down here. So this is the perfect opportunity for me to shift gears into those stories that I mentioned earlier, right? So I had 3 stories for you that are going to give you an important historical context for why we have the architecture in the city that we do today. The first story I want to talk about is the Great Chicago Fire. Now, the year was 1871, October 8th, Sunday night at 9 p.m. About a half-mile to our right, a fire broke out in Mrs. O'Leary's barn. We'll talk about how the fire started in a minute. But what we know is that the 30-mile-per-hour winds over the next few days made it one of the most devastating urban fires in the history of civilization. In fact, at 2 separate moments, that wind created fire cyclones, which actually jumped over the river and spread the fire even further. This fire raged over the course of 3 days. And when all was said and done, over 17,000 buildings had burnt down. Over 100,000 people were left entirely homeless. Over 300 people died, and a 3.5 square mile chunk of the city center was gone forever. This was incredibly devastating to the city. But people always want to know how the fire started. And that's where the big myth comes in. Now, Mrs. O'Leary, remember her? It was her barn where the fire started. Well, she was an Irish Catholic immigrant. And there was a lot of animosity towards Irish Catholic immigrants in the city at the time. Chicago was angry. They were looking for someone to blame, and Mrs. O'Leary fit the bill. But the city didn't blame Mrs. O'Leary exactly. Instead, they chose to blame her cow. This is true. It was the city's story that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the kerosene lantern that started the Great Chicago Fire. But I'm going to keep it real. I'm originally from Southern Illinois, cattle country. I've known a few cows in my day. And I think the cow was framed. I think it was set up. In fact, I would go so far as to say it was a cowspiracy. Brace yourselves, I'm just getting started. In fact, I think it is utterly unjust that the city had a beef with Mrs. O'Leary who had to hoof it out of town. That's what I heard. Now, holy cow, I know there was a lot at stake, but I think it's high time Chicago stop milking this cheesy story, stop crying over spilt lanterns, and move on. Quite a different experience delivering those puns to a mostly empty deck. But you've survived the puns, and you've survived the weather thus far. Again, a reminder that downstairs we do have blankets, hoodies, gloves, and sock hats. So please do grab one of those if you need it. Now, everyone agrees that the fire was about the worst thing that could have happened in the city. But it also, looking back on it, ended up being one of the best things that happened to Chicago. Why? Because shortly after the fire, a lot of young and up-and-coming architects flocked to the city because they knew there was going to be a massive effort to help Chicago rebuild and get some plans to the new. Which is why less than half a generation after the fire, Chicago became home to the first 10-story steel-framed skyscraper. That was right here in the Windy City. And that was story number one. Which brings me to story number two. So 22 short years after the fire had devastated the city, Chicago had rebuilt itself enough to host the 1893 World's Fair. Now, the original site of the World's Fair was in Jackson Park. That's a beautiful park on the south side of the city along the lakefront, still there today. And the city hired young architect Daniel Burnham to design the campus of the World's Fair. Now, Burnham was obsessed with old world European-style grand architecture, so he designed a campus of over 200 buildings, mostly temporary. They were just the facades, meaning the front of the buildings. He had them all painted white. And he had a massive restructuring of the landscape. Some of the streets were even turned into canals, and you had to use boats to travel up and down them. And in the 6 months the fair was operating, over 27 million people came through the gates, which for 1893 is pretty impressive. And that's important, because when those people left, they went back home to their cities, London, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, Boston, New York, and they told folks back home that Chicago was badly damaged. It was a world-class city once again. So you can see why the fair was really important to Chicago. And that was story number two, which brings me to my third and final story. Now, remember Daniel Burnham? He was the guy who designed the World's Fair campus. Well, the city was so happy with the job that he did, that they asked him if he would redraw the map of the city of Chicago so that we could sustain ourselves as a world-class city well into the future. Daniel Burnham agreed, and he drafted the Burnham Plan of 1909. Arguably the most important piece of Chicago's history, and believed to be the first comprehensive urban plan for any city in the country. And something really important to understand about Burnham is that he followed the city movement. And people that followed that movement had one simple belief. They believed that beauty itself, and therefore beautiful cities, had an extraordinary impact. And I gotta say, to turn Chicago into the Paris of the Great. With big boulevards, wide vistas, parks everywhere, fountains on every corner. And the Burnham Plan is why we have so many things in Chicago to this day that we love so much. Here are just a few of the things that you can find in Chicago that were part of the Burnham Plan. Remember the river walk that I pointed out earlier? That was part of the plan. Also, Museum Campus, where Shedd Aquarium, Adler Planetarium, and the Field Museum are located. That was written into the plan. Navy Pier was part of the Burnham Plan. Now, Navy Pier was originally called Municipal Pier. It was renamed Navy Pier in 1927, and that's because there were some Navy servicemen who were stationed there during World War I. But why were there Navy servicemen at Navy Pier on a lake during the First World War? Well, that's because the U.S. military has long been using the Great Lakes as training grounds because they can simulate ocean-like environments there. That's why we had some Navy folks there. Another really important part of the Burnham Plan, which I think is very important, Chicago grid-style streets. So the fact that every 8 blocks is 1 mile, and every 100 numbers on a street address is 1 city block, that was codified and clarified in the Burnham Plan, which makes it a lot easier to get around without a GPS. And then the last thing I'll mention from the plan, which some people think is kind of funny, but I think is very important, 18-foot wide alleyways. Why does that matter? Well, because if you want to build a beautiful city, you have to design somewhere to hide your trash. So, no shade to New York City, but we're very grateful we don't have to put our trash on our sidewalks. So, thank you, Daniel Burnham, for those wide alleyways. And that was story number 3. So, again, you can see how those 3 stories are really important to understanding why we have the architecture that we have. The fire destroyed, the fair reanimated, and the plan beautified. And of course, we can trace it all the way back to that poor cow. But I like to tell everyone, please do not worry about Mrs. O'Leary and her cow, because City Council promptly exonerated them both in 1997. Mostly symbolic. And thus concludes story time. For those of you on the lower deck, it's still kind of windy up here, but just so you know, it is no longer raining/snowing. If you want to re-emerge, especially once we get closer to these buildings up ahead, this wind is going to die down a bit. This building here to the right, this concrete building, do you all remember the corncob towers of Marina City from earlier on? This is the same designer, Bertrand Goldberg, and this is River City. So again, he was really interested in designing cities within cities. Those 2 lower levels with the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, those are your commercial spaces, and the residences are up above that. And of course, what city within a city would be complete without somewhere to park your yacht? All right, folks, why don't we turn our attention back to the Chicago skyline up ahead, and I would love to introduce you all to the royal family of Chicago. Starting with this massive black tower straight ahead with the 2 wide antennas on the roof, that's the king himself, the Sears or Willis Tower, depending on who you ask. In front of the king, that building with the pink granite and the bluish reflective windows and the green barrels on top, that's the Queen, or 311 South Wacker Drive. But I want to start off by introducing you all to the princess. And that is this building coming into view up ahead on the right with the statue on the roof. Statue that kind of looks like the Oscar statuette, yeah? This is another Art Deco building from 1929, the Chicago Board of Trade. Again, you can tell it's Art Deco because of those racing stripe windows and the limestone facade. That statue on the roof is a statue of the Roman goddess Ceres. And Ceres is the goddess of agriculture, which is appropriate because the Board of Trade is originally where Chicago traded agricultural futures in the stock market. And a fun fact about that statue, the sculptor used for his model a West Side Barber's 14-year-old daughter, which I think is a pretty cool claim to fame. To be able to point to a building and be like, you see that statue on the roof? That's me. All right, back to the Queen. 311 South Wacker Drive, straight ahead with the barrels on the roof. Now, when this building was finished in 1990, those barrels on the roof were originally illuminated with over 1,800 fluorescent tube lights. Now, those have mostly been replaced with LEDs and energy-efficient bulbs, and that's because when the building was first finished, at night when the barrels were lit up, migrating flocks of birds would mistake the roof for the moon. It would disrupt their flight patterns. That's why twice a year now in the spring and fall months, those barrels are dimmed significantly so they don't interrupt the birds' flight patterns. True story. And that brings us back to the king himself, the Sears or Willis Tower, depending on who you ask. Now, back in 1974, Sears department store built the tallest building in the world right here in the Windy City. That's the Sears Tower. Now, they did leave the building in Chicago in the early 90s, which was a bummer for us. They were a large employer. But then back in 2014, Willis Insurance Group signed a lease for 3 floors of office space in the Sears Tower out of 110. And in that lease was also a clause that said for an extra $1 million a year, they could also lease the naming rights. So for $1 million a year, Willis Insurance Group gets to call that building the Willis Tower. Now listen, I've been in Chicago long enough. I consider myself a local. And like the locals, I'm stubborn. So I still call it the Sears Tower. But the technical name these days is the Willis Tower. If you're looking for it on a map, that's what you're looking for. Now, much like 150 North Riverside, that building with a narrow base, the builders needed to make sure the Sears could also sway in the wind because it's very tall and very narrow. So this building is designed to sway up to 18 inches in either direction. That's about 1.5 feet. Although on an average day, it's only about 6 inches. Yes, if you're inside the building while it's swaying, you can feel it. I guarantee you the folks in that building right now can feel this wind. Now the Sears clocks in at 1,451 feet tall. But how do we measure a building's height, right? Where do you start? Where do you stop? Well, the Council on Tall Buildings, which is the very original name of that council, has determined to measure a building's height. You start at the threshold of the lowest open-air public entrance, and you measure all the way to the top of the structure, or permanent spire. And permanent spire is relevant with the Sears because those 2 antennas are not considered permanent, so they don't actually count towards the overall height of the building. Now, the Sears was the tallest building in the world for 24 years, which is an incredible amount of time to hold that record. But the tallest building in the world today is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. It's over 2,700 feet, which makes it almost twice the height of the Sears Tower. Quick glimpse of the side of the Sears through this gap here. You see those 4 glass boxes sticking out of this side of the tallest tower? Kind of lit up there? That floor is called the Sky Deck, and those glass boxes are called the Ledge. And if you want, you can buy a ticket, go up to that floor, walk out into one of those glass boxes, look through the glass floor all the way down to the street below. Now, if that sounds like fun to you, go for it. I will be staying down here, as ironically, I am very afraid of heights. But I have seen some photos of my friends up in those boxes, and it does look pretty cool if you can stomach it. They definitely make me feel a little queasy just looking at them, though. Now, remember I said those antennas don't count towards the overall height, right? Well, just for some context, they're about 280 feet tall each, which happens to be the same height as these black box buildings up here on the left that we already talked about. So that shows you just how massive those antennas are. And then I have one last fact about the Sears, and it's my favorite. And that is that 2 climbers have successfully scaled the entire height of the Sears Tower since it was built. The first was in the 80s. American climber Dan Goodwin dressed up like Spider-Man and used suction cups to climb all the way to the top of the building. It was pretty cool. The video made it look like Spider-Man is real and he lives in Chicago. But then, and this is very true, French climber Alain Robert came to Chicago and he climbed the entire height of the Sears Tower with no equipment at all. Absolutely wacky, if you ask me. Of course, they were both immediately arrested when they made it back down to the ground, because apparently it's very illegal to climb a skyscraper. And that is the Sears or Willis Tower. All right, folks, I'm going to share some Chicago nicknames with you. You've probably heard a few of them. Pretty famous nickname is the Second City. We have a famous comedy club here by that name. A lot of writers and performers on Saturday Night Live start off their careers at the Second City. Kind of a training ground for them. And you now know the reason why it's called the Second City. And that is because the first city burnt down. So this is quite literally the second one. Another nickname, which is very appropriate today, the Windy City. Although, funnily enough, the wind is not actually where that nickname comes from. It comes from the World's Fair. So leading up to the 1893 World's Fair, local politicians had to go to Congress and ask them for money and support to host the fair. And in a now infamous quote, one of those congressmen referred to them as those windbag blowhards from Chicago. And that's the true story of the Windy City nickname. Another nickname is the City That Works. And of course, that's because we have a large working class population here. We're proud of that reputation. But I think we're also the city that works because we're the city that functions. We are a well-rounded city. we have a vibrant arts and culture scene. Here on the right is the Civic Opera Building. This is the second largest opera house in the country, 3,600 seats. Currently home to Lyric Opera of Chicago. That is a world-renowned opera company. Chicago is also home to over 200 theater companies, ranging in size from small little 40-seat storefront theaters all the way up to cultural mainstays like the Goodman Theater, Steppenwolf Theater, or Chicago Shakespeare Theater. Now, I am an actor myself. I graduated last year with my master's in acting, and I am endlessly grateful to live in such a world-class theater city like Chicago. If you're in Chicago for a few days and you're looking for something to do, get online and look up some shows. Gold Star is a great app you can use on your phone to get some cheap tickets. There is always incredible work being done in the city, and I promise you will not regret it. And then this is a part of the tour where I get to talk about food, which makes me always excited because I love food. And I'm going to share some of my favorite Chicago staples with you. Of course, there's deep dish pizza, Chicago-style hot dogs, Italian beef, Italian ice, popcorn, believe it or not. Now, there has been a long-ranging debate about where to get the best deep dish pizza in Chicago, and I'm going to enter into that debate right now. So there are 3 chains of deep dish pizza in the city that you cannot go wrong with. They all make delicious pizza. Those are Lou Malnati's, Gino's, or Giordano's. But for my money, the best place to get pizza in Chicago is at a place called Pequod's Pizza. P-E-Q-U-O-D. It's up in a neighborhood called Lincoln Park. They bake their pizzas in cast iron skillets, which gives them this incredible caramelized crust. You can't beat it. And then, to finish off this section on food, I have one last tip for you, and this is incredibly important, so I need you to listen closely. If you would like to order a hot dog while you're in Chicago, whatever you do not ask for ketchup on it. Now, she knows what I'm talking about. I don't know why that's a rule, but it is. And if you ask for ketchup on your hot dog, you're probably going to be shamed by everyone around you, including the person you ordered it from. That happened to me when I first moved here. But if you want to get a Chicago-style hot dog, which is my absolute favorite way to eat one, you're going to ask them to drag it through the garden, and they're going to put pickles, peppers, relish, tomatoes, onions, mustard, and celery salt on it. My absolute favorite way to eat a hot dog. And if you're looking for any recommendations on any of that food, let me know after the tour. I got plenty. All right, let's get back to some buildings, shall we? So I want to revisit a building that we talked about early on, and that's this massive Art Deco building straight ahead on the left side of the river. This is the Merchandise Mart. It was the first Art Deco building that we talked about. And I bring it up again because for many decades it was the largest commercial building in the entire world. It is no longer, but it's still massive. It occupies 2 downtown city blocks, and it only has 25 floors, but that is misleading because it also has 43 elevators, 96 acres of total office space, which is the equivalent of 73 American-sized football fields. And for many years, it also had its own fire station, police station, and zip code. Now, it does share all those today, but it's still a very massive building. One of the richest historical buildings that we have in the city of Chicago. Marshall Fields, that's a famous retailer that helped construct the early city of Chicago, and he was instrumental in the construction and maintenance of this building in its early years. It was then purchased by the Kennedys in the 40s, and they poured a lot more money into renovating it. So if you're looking for some more history, go online and look up the Merchandise Mart. There's a lot. But my favorite part about the Merchandise Mart is actually over here on the right. You see that glass box mounted on the side of the Riverwalk there? Inside that box, 32 projectors. It's an $8 million projector system. And every night in the summer, twice a night, that box displays digital animated art on the walls of the Merchandise Mart. It's called Art on the Mart. The coolest part about these animations is that the designers have intentionally left out window-sized holes from all of their projections so that no light shines through the windows and disturbs the tenants inside. So it just displays on that limestone facade. Highly recommend if you're here in the summer, come down to the Riverwalk, check it out. It's free and it's absolutely stunning. The artists put a lot of work into it. All right, quick up ahead above the LaSalle Street Bridge in the distance, this is, I think, the most underrated view on the river. And the reason why is if you look up at that cluster of buildings in the distance, it is such an incredible representation of the architecture in the city. You can see the various styles, all the variety that we have here in our skyline, and each building represents a different part in Chicago history. So for that reason and that reason alone, I like to point out that view because for my money, it's one of the best. All right, folks, we're passing under the LaSalle Street